Good day everyone and welcome to my presentation. My name is Rosel Tenorio. I am a college student studying Bachelor of Library and Information Science. Today, I will be discussing the topic about developing the research study. More research effort is wasted by going off half-prepared, with only a vague set of ideas and procedures than in any other way. When planning for research, the first question that a researcher may ask is, where do I begin? Or in other words, where does the planning begin? It was stated by Lydian Ormrod that by asking questions will lead us to research process. An inquisitive mind, or our desire to know more or learn more, is the beginning of research. Historically, new knowledge has been sought either by means of deductive logic or through the use of inductive reasoning. Deductive is from the information we get the pattern or tentative hypothesis until we come up with a theory. While in inductive, from the theory, we get the hypothesis, we observe it until we confirm it. Now we have the scientific method of inquiry. Inductive reasoning contributed to the development of scientific method or the scientific method of inquiry (S&I). Liddy describes scientific method of inquiry as the means by which insight into undiscovered truth. It is sought by identifying the problem that will provide the goal of the research, gathering the data needed to resolve the problem, developing a tentative hypothesis, and lastly, empirically testing the hypothesis by analyzing the data. Bobby sees scientific method of inquiry as a combination of inductive and deductive methods depending upon the research phase, and he summarizes the basic steps of the scientific method as identification of an idea or interest, theory construction, derivation of theoretical hypotheses or expectations, operationalizations of concepts, and testing of hypotheses. Frankfurt Napier stated that the research process consists of 7 principal stages. First is the problem, second is hypothesis, third is research design, fourth is measurement, fifth stage is the data collection, and the sixth is data analysis, and lastly, the generalization stage. We must study the intellectual foundations of the LIS field. Buds remind us that general progress only occurs when there has been deep critical investigations into the workings of our field. Research is a cyclical process. Here are the general outlines for research. Here is an example. A college librarian may wonder why the use of his or her library seems to be declining or better yet increasing. She may have a hunch that library use is low because the majority of the students do not have adequate library skills. The librarian should consider developing one or more hypotheses to guide the future investigations or study. The librarian will need to develop a plan for attempting to resolve the problem. A survey could be conducted in which students would, for example, he asked about their library use and/or skills. Data collected during the library instruction study could include scores on tests, attitudes toward the library, and self-perceptions of library skills. And last but not the least, the librarian should keep in mind that this process is almost always circular in nature. Now let's proceed to the general criteria for basic research. In addition to adhering to a general outline, basic research studies generally should meet certain criteria to qualify as basic or pure research. They are 4 in general. First is universality, which means that the study should be researchable by any other qualified investigator. Second is reputation, which is related to the criteria research study. And lastly, measurement, which constitutes the observation and recording of phenomena. Hernon categorizes the criteria for basic research into the following 5 components. 1. Reflective inquiry, which includes a problem statement, a literature review, a theoretical framework, a logical structure, objectives, research questions, and hypotheses if appropriate. 2. Procedures or research design and data collection methods. 3. Data gathering, processing, and analysis. 4. Reliability and validity for quantitative studies, and credibility. Trustworthiness, transferability, dependability, and confirmability for quantitative studies. And lastly, presentation of research findings. Now let's proceed to the identification of the problem. The research problem is essentially the topic to be investigated or what needs to be known. In fact, Einstein and Enfield have been quoted as saying that the formulation of a problem is often more essential than its solution. Or Liddy and Ormerod stated that the heart of every research project is the problem. It is paramount in importance to the success of the research effort. But given the primary importance of identifying a problem before conducting research, we ask where and how are problems found? Well, to answer to the first part of this question is that problems are all around us. And in response to the second part of the question, we can take a variety of approaches. For example, one important, if not essential, approach towards identifying problems for research in a given field is to develop a thorough knowledge and understanding of that field. More specifically, the would-be researcher should be fully familiar with the known facts and accepted ideas in the field, be knowledgeable of previous related research in the area, and be aware of gaps in knowledge in the field or unresearched areas. These objectives can be met at least in part by reading published research, checking of new bibliographies and other lists of related materials, like example, Domain Assumptions of Research by Jacques Desgagiers, disagreeing with some previous research and developing a study to test its findings, and lastly, networking. Here are the characteristics of a problem suitable for basic research. First, the problem should represent conceptual thinking, inquiry, and insight, not merely activity. Second, the variables related to the problem should represent some sort of meaningful relationship. And last but not the least, the problem should point to research that is manageable. In writing the statement of a problem, it should be written in complete grammatical sentences, not in mere phrases. It should be written as clearly as possible, and it should be stated in straightforward, and the problem should be stated as precisely as possible. For example, the problem statement library instruction and library use would be better expressed as the problem to be resolved is whether providing college students with library instruction will have some effect on their use of the library. Hernon stated that many studies published in LIS do not contain a problem statement or confuse such a statement with a statement of the purpose. In a lecture conducted by David Clark, they suggest writing 3 short sentences, the lead-in, a statement about originality, and a justification. The problem is what the research is about, and the purpose is why it is conducted. For example, one might conduct research on the relationship between certain teaching methods and the effectiveness of bibliographic instruction, the problem, and in order to increase the success of the future bibliographic instruction programs is the purpose. Identifying subproblems. Virtually all problems contain components or subproblems. And to identify the subproblems, there are two basic steps. First, the researcher should break the main problem down into its components. Second, he or she should identify the words that indicate a need for the collection and interpretation of data. Here is an example of a problem statement. The problem to be resolved by this study is whether the frequency of library use of first-year college students given course-integrated library instruction is different from the frequency of library use of first-year college students not given course-integrated library instruction. There are three components that will require investigation before the main problem can be resolved. These three subproblems can be written as follows. 1. What is the frequency of library use of the first-year college students who did receive course-integrated library instruction? 2. What is the frequency of the library use of the first-year college students who did not receive course-integrated library instruction? And lastly, what is the difference in the frequency of library use between the two groups of students? Now let's proceed to the role of theory in the design of research. Before taking up assumptions and hypotheses, we should consider the role of theory in the design of research study. But before discussing theory, the term method theory should be considered briefly, although it does not appear much in Elias literature. Method theory is the philosophy behind the theory, the fundamental set of ideas about how phenomena of interest in a particular field should be thought about and researched. Closely related to it is the paradigm presented by Kuhn in the field of science, which is shown in the picture. Theory is the first major component of the scientific method of inquiry. It tends to be the base from which the subsequent stages of the scientific method flow. But exactly how does the theory fit into or affect this process? To answer that question, an understanding of how a field of knowledge develops should help to explain the role of theory in the design of research. A field of knowledge usually develops in a logical sequence of three stages. First stage is the description, prediction, and explanation. The second stage is the definition, review, and classification. And the third stage is to develop a theory. Theory helps to make research more productive in that it organizes a number of unassorted facts, laws, concepts, constructs, and principles into a meaningful and manageable form. Theory also can help to connect studies and facilitate the interpretation of a larger meaning of research findings. The main value of theory in research is to summarize existing knowledge, to provide an explanation for observed events and relationships, and to predict the occurrence of as yet unobserved events and relationships on the basis of the explanatory principles embedded in the theory. Here are some definitions of theory. According to Bobby, theory is a systematic explanation for the observations that relate to particular aspects of life. Marshall defined theory as a set of related propositions that suggest why events occur in the manner that they do. The propositions that make up theories are of the same form as hypotheses. They consist of concepts and the linkage of relationships between them. The formation of theories. Molly states that a good theory should meet the following criteria. 1. A theory or theoretical system should permit deductions that can be tested empirically. In other words, it should provide the means for its own testing. A theory should be compatible with both observation and previously verified theories. It must be well-grounded and should be able to explain the phenomena under study. And the theory should be stated as simple as possible. It should explain adequately the existing knowledge, but should not be any more complex than necessary. These characteristics represents the so-called law of parsimony. Testing the theory. Having developed or at least identified a suitable theory, the next requisite step is to test it. In order to test a theory, one must determine how well each of its theorems and related propositions agrees with the observed facts in one or more test situations. Second, it should be noted that a well-constructed informative theory would provide specific hypotheses or statements of certain relationships by which the theory can be tested. Now let's proceed to formulating hypotheses. The second major step in the standard scientific method of inquiry is the formulation of one or more theoretical hypotheses. Here are some definitions of hypothesis. Bobby defines hypothesis as a testable expectation about empirical reality that follows from a more general propositions. According to Liddy and Ormrod, hypothesis is a tentative propositions set forth to assess in guiding the investigation of a problem or to provide possible explanations for the observations made. Here are the types of hypotheses. The sources of hypothesis. As was suggested earlier, one of the most convenient and logical sources of hypothesis is a theory. Here is another sources of hypothesis, which is the pilot or exploratory studies. Molly states that some amount of data gathering, such as the recall of past experience, the review of related literature, or a pilot study, must precede the formulation and refinement of the hypothesis. One of the major components of hypothesis is the variable. Variable is any property of a person, thing, event, setting, and so on that is not fixed. There are two main factors of variables, the independent variables or the predictor or experimental variable, and the dependent variables or the subject variables. Here are other types of variables. Concepts. A researcher, in order to organize his or her data so as to perceive relationships among variables, must first make use of concept. A concept may be defined as an abstraction from observed events or a shorthand representation of a variety of facts. Its purpose is to simplify thinking by subsumming a number of events under one general heading. Here are the desirable characteristics of hypothesis: generalizability or universality, compatibility with existing knowledge, testability, invariability, and lastly, causality. Testing the hypothesis. First, the researcher deductively develops certain logical implications, also known as logical consequences, and criteria, which, when stated in operational terms, can help to reject or support the hypothesis. The second basic steps in testing an hypothesis involves actual subjecting it to a trial by collecting and analyzing relevant data. Now let's proceed to the validity and reliability. As one develops and conducts a research study, one must always be concerned with its validity and reliability. Research design must occur at the beginning of a research project, but it involves all the steps that follow. Validity of research design. There are at least three types. Internal validity. A research design is internal valid if it accurately identifies causal relationships. Construct validity. Variables being investigated can be identified and labeled properly. And external validity. Its conclusions are true or hold up beyond the confines of a particular study. Validity in measurement. In brief, the extent to which an instrument measures what is designed to measure indicates the level of validity of that measure. There are basic types of validity as they relate to measurement. Logical validity, generally based on expert judgment. Empirical validity, based on external, objective criteria. And construct validity, based on both logical judgment and external criteria. Reliability of research design. If If the design of research study is reliable, then its findings should be repeatable or replicable and generalizable beyond the one study. Reliability and measurement methods for assessing the reliability or stability of measurements techniques. Test, retest correlation, and average item total correlation. Scales. American Heritage Dictionary defines scales as a progressive classification as of size, amount, importance, or rank, a relative level or degree. There are 4 types of measurement scales: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratios scale. A question was stated as a question half answered. Would-be researchers should realize that the time that goes into the conceptual development and planning of a research study is time well spent, and it will result in fewer problems in the later stages of the research.